What's going on, guys? My name is Joe. You can find me everywhere online as Tattoo Theist. There have been a lot of conversations recently about Bible translations, which translation to use. Most churches seem to be using the NIV. Is the NIV what I should use? Some other churches are stuck on the NLV. And then you have other churches who simply will use nothing other than the ESV. So there's a lot of debate. There's a lot of contention about certain translations being inaccurate, certain translations being full of improper translation, improper context, improper application of historical terms. There's a lot. And like most things within Christianity, we have a tendency to make these things war songs. We have this tendency to become very tribalistic about what translation you use, just like what denomination you might be a part of, or what church you go to, or what theology they might teach at that church. So this is going to be a short video where we really just talk about three of the most dominant translations that churches use, that your average believer might use, and then what scholars also use as well. I'll give you a very brief description of what each translation is, and then we're going to talk about kind of what each one could be used for, why we have so many different translations, and then I'm going to make one comment about a translation that irks my soul. So let's go ahead and hop right in. So what is the ESV? The ESV stands for English Standard Version. A little bit about the history. It is a modified version of the Revised Standard Version. So that's the RSV. This was also a very popular translation of the Bible for a very long time. So it's a revised version of that. And that, the RSV, was introduced in 1971. The basic motive of this version of the Bible was to produce a literal translation of the original text of the Bible. So that's the original Hebrew and the original Greek, right? Then you've got the NIV. That is probably the most commonly used translation of the Bible in your average non-denominational church and beyond. And I'll tell you why here in a minute. But a little bit about the NIV is it refers to an English translation of the Bible that is the result of demands from the Puritans to bring out a new reformed version of the Bible. Then the NLT. Most of you probably know the NLT. This is where a lot of people like to start, is reading the NLT, and there's a very good reason for that. And you should not hate on people who use it because they use it for good reason. Introduced to English-speaking people for the first time in 1996. So this is a relatively new translation as far as biblical translations go. This was derived from the original Hebrew and into, obviously, modern English. The fourth one that we're going to touch on, but no way do I recommend you read this, is the KJV. And I know the KJV people are going to be very upset, but I will give you good reason as to why we don't use the KJV. But we will get there. So first, what is the difference between the ESV, the NIV, and the NLT? The ESV is a word-for-word translation of the Bible. The NIV is a mixture of word-for-word and thought-for-thought of the Bible. So there's a differentiation there. Now, if you put a parallel up of the ESV and the NIV, you will see massive, massive cohesiveness, right? Because they both have word for word. The difference is going to be, and you will notice it depending on how many verses you go parallel with, is the NIV, it does mix with thought for thought. You have three kind of major or main ways of translating the Bible. You have word for word, you have thought for thought, and then you have a paraphrase translation. The difference between them is kind of self-explanatory. Word for word, the translator's goal was to be as literally accurate as possible. So they go by word on word on word in the Hebrew and then in the Greek, and they do their absolute best to translate the literal word, each word at a time. And then you have a thought for thought translation. That differs in that they'll take a section of text or a thought as a whole, and they'll try to translate that thought, the emotion it was trying to get across, what the context of the thought in and of itself was. So this could be a verse, this could be a small collection of verses. And then what the NIV does also, beyond thought for thought, is they do mix it with word for word. That's why you get some very strong parallels between the ESV and the NIV. The NLT, the New Living Translation, differs heavily, and you need to know that because it's not good for studying the Bible. And the reason is this is a paraphrase version of the Bible. So it goes past word for word, it goes past thought for thought, and then it goes a little bit beyond, and it is paraphrasing. So the purpose of the NLT, the New Living Translation, was to focus on readability. It was meant to go to your believer who might be new to the faith, or might be somebody who is somewhat illiterate, and I do not mean that at all disparagingly. I mean literally, somebody who's not good at reading, somebody who struggles with reading something that's dry, even somebody who has poor attention span. It's good. The NLT is really, really good for if you want to read the stories of the Bible and you want to kind of know what was happening, rather than struggling reading a very dry historical account of the Old Testament or even of the New Testament. The NLT would take the stories and the general concepts and they would paraphrase it into something that was readable, something that you could actually, it was like a story. It would actually read like a story, whereas the Bible doesn't read like a story. It reads like a mixture of poetry and historical account and gospel and epistles. It's very difficult to read the Bible as is. It's extremely difficult to read it in the original language, whether or not you know the language. And then it's very difficult to read it in something like the ESV, where it's word for word, because the reality is the Bible is dry. It's very dry, unless you're really into it, like some of us. Like people like me love it, but that's not your average believer. Your average believer is going to have a hard time reading through the Bible. And so what the translators were trying to do is they were trying to encapsulate the meaning of the text, the story, the history, the context, and they were trying to put it together in a way that somebody just coming in or somebody who has a hard time reading biblical text could pick it up and it would read like a storybook where it interests them. They understood the message, but it's not something you would want to quote from, right? Because it's not word for word. It's not even thought for thought. It takes it beyond that. So the New Living Translation is great for kids. It's a version that I do read with my daughter because it reads like a story, and kids can actually zone in and they can remember the story. The NIV is good for people who are potentially new still, but are more into it, or just are adults, and they can actually sit and deal with some of the parts that are dry or hard to understand. And the ESV is really good for people who are scripturally literate, meaning you have some kind of background in understanding and reading the Bible, or people who are truly trying to study the word. Because the ESV is what I'll use on like a regular basis. And I want to know exactly what it is saying. Primarily, obviously, because I teach this stuff. So I don't want to go off the NLT because it's not going to be very accurate. But if I was trying to tell somebody who is new to go read this story, I might suggest they go read the NLT. There's nothing wrong with that. This siloing of each other into these translations it's not right. Now, granted, side note, and I'm going to talk out both sides of my mouth, we have so many translations of the Bible, and some of them are not good. Some of them had corrupt backgrounds. Some of them were put together by people who had very iffy theology. And some of them were put together by people who were straight up corrupt and wanted to change the meanings of certain texts. And so that kind of brings us into the hot topic of the KJV. So I grew up on the KJV. I grew up Catholic. I grew up in we're doing this old school. We're staying with the original. That's what you'll hear from the KJV people is this is the original. It's the truest. It's the most accurate. It's the best. It's the best. This is just simply not true. The KJV is, one, it's hard to read because it's Old English, and most people in our culture are going to have a very difficult time reading Old English. It's just not easy. But beyond that, without going into too much detail, and if you guys want me to do a video on the KJV specifically, just the KJV, I'm happy to do that. So let me know. But some of the main points were that the king who put this together, he had ideas and he had thoughts and he had preconceptions and he had his own opinions about things and about the way the Bible was written. And he went out to restructure some of that. So he thought that there wasn't enough respect shown towards kings in the Old Testament. And so he had some of that rewritten, phrased different ways, conveyed different ways. That's not right. If you're trying to literally translate a historical document, it's not the right way to do it. That's called having a bias and putting your bias into the Bible. It was also politically driven due to the Church of England and the Puritans currently having contention. So that also put bias into the way that the KJV was put together. The one of the other big points, and there's more than a handful of key points as to why to not use the King James Bible, but the transcribers of the time who were taking it from Greek into the language, they were not fluent or familiar with Koine Greek. They were with Common Greek, and there's a difference between the two. So you're taking people who weren't fully literate in the type of Greek that the New Testament was actually written in, and they translated it. So this is obviously going to cause some degree of problems, right? So the KJV, and again, I'll do a video if you guys tell me to, but I don't want to harp on it too much. The KJV is not a good Bible to study at all. It's not a good Bible, in my opinion, to read then either, because the only reason to really stray away from something like the NIV or the ESV, in my opinion, and there's others, like the New American Standard Version, there's others that are good, that are word for word or for a mixture of word for word and thought for thought. But the NIV and the ESV are the top for sure. So if you're going to stray away from the NIV or the ESV, the only reason you'd want to do that is for readability, in any sense, is for readability. So that either you can get more out of the stories, so you can focus more and not get so lost, or so that you can refer it to somebody else who needs that kind of Bible to get the message. But I would never see any situation or circumstance where you would want to recommend or read yourself the King James Version of the Bible, unless you're doing it just to study the King James Version of the Bible, to see what is different, to see what was changed. So to wrap things up, we've got 4 things you need to understand. The reality is all translations have problems, because the reality is Hebrew does not translate to English. Greek does not translate to English. They just don't. So you have to make sacrifices. You have to be willing to give somewhere, which is part of why we have so many translations, is scholars and translators have had to kind of pick and choose what they're willing to sacrifice, what they're willing to give up, and what they feel is necessary to get a message that was in the Greek or the Hebrew across into the English. And a lot of that is justifiable, because the languages, they don't connect properly. They don't. And that's not just those languages. There's a lot of languages that are still spoken around the world today that if you were to try to word for word translate them to English, it just doesn't work. The other thing is that if literal accuracy is your goal, or if studying is your goal, you're going to want to stick with the ESV. That's going to be your best bet. It's going to be the closest to word for word. And like I said, there are other versions, but these are the tops. These are what we're talking about. Stick with the ESV. If you're trying to study, if you're trying to really understand what the Bible says exactly academically, then the ESV is where you're going to want to be. If you know a little bit, have a little bit of background, want to do some studying, but also want some readability, then go with the NIV. That's why most churches use the NIV, is because it's got a mixture of both. So it's a really, really good translation. And then if you're someone like we talked about who needs ultimate readability, or you just want to read the stories. Sometimes I just read the stories in the Bible because I just want to be entertained, and I like the Bible because I'm a geek. So I'll read the NLT because it reads more like a story. And honestly, some of it is so poetic and beautiful that some of the verses, the way they structured them in the NLT, is just gorgeous. It's really beautiful. It's very poetic. Some of the things, the ways that they put the terms together and the verses together in the New Testament specifically, they're beautiful. Oh, they're beautiful. So definitely go for that if that's your goal. There's nothing wrong with any of these translations, and people who hate on each other for using certain translations are ridiculous. Get off your soapbox, chill, and understand that the reason we have different translations is for good reason. It's not willy-nilly, and it's not because everybody was just arguing. There is a lot of that for sure, but there's good reason that we have different translations. And if you want to learn the stories, have a little bit of real text, word for word, and really get everything, then read a mixture of them. All these websites now, man, have the ability for you to put parallels up. I know that Bible.com does. I know Bible Gateway does. I know really all of them do. Bible Hub, everybody's got the ability. So pull up an NLT and pull up an ESV and look at them side by side while you read. And then you can see where the translators decided to give, where they decided to take, why did they go with that over this. It's really interesting. If you're somebody who's into reading the Bible, or you're somebody who's trying to genuinely study, then pull them both up. If you learned anything from this video, do me a favor, hit the like button, leave a comment. What translation do you use? And then tell me why, because I'm curious. I just did a live and talked to some people about it, and I got their opinions, and it was very interesting. So let me know what you guys use and the reason that you use it. I love you guys.